Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the numbers add up to famine. In Sudan, 2.5 million people could die by September.
I've never seen the international community turn a blind eye to any catastrophe as much as they've been doing to the Sudanese catastrophe.
How Sudanese are trying to fill the gap. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
Sudanese culture is about sharing. You have a situation where a person can afford 2 meals a day, so they are having one meal, so their neighbor who has no meals can have one meal also.
Mohanad Balal is one of the founders of Khartoum Kitchen. It's a food aid initiative to help feed the millions of Sudanese people currently going hungry.
So the quality of what was being provided by a lot of kitchens was very nutritiously poor. And in response to increased demand, what ended up happening is that stews kept on getting watered down until the point everybody was being served effectively flavored water.
Though Mohanad is based in the UK, he's been working with relatives in Sudan on the project since March. They're now directly running 11 kitchens, and 4 more that they run with partners.
We decided that we were going to make sure what we give was nutritious. So we decided to do lentil stew, but to combine our lentil stew with peanut butter. Peanut butter is high in protein and is also calorie dense. And Sudan is a major peanut producer. In Arabic, peanuts are called al-Ful al-Sudani, Sudanese nuts, because it's associated with the country. So we served the nutritious stew initially to roughly 400 people, and we served it with bread. Immediately, the lines began to grow and grow, and it became beyond the means which I could personally fund.
As the fighting continues across Sudan, people are having to change their diets to make food supplies stretch further.
The number of Sudanese facing emergency levels of hunger, one stage before famine, has more than tripled.
It's something Al Jazeera English's correspondent in Sudan, Hiba Morgan, has noticed as well.
When we go to the markets and speak to people, one person would say, well, yes, I can afford, but I just can't afford meat anymore. Or, yes, I can afford, vegetables, but I have to back away from the potato and just rely on just the greens because it's easier to make, but it's also cheaper and affordable. That's one thing I've noticed. When you speak to more and more people, they would say, well, even at the early days of the conflict, I was able to afford 2 to 3 meals a day, but now I can't, so I have a single meal a day. I can't get eggs for my children, even though that's what they like to have for breakfast. Or if they just get, the peanuts, the Sudanese beans that they have for breakfast, people would say, well, we have to add a lot of water to that so that, the children can feel like they're eating more to be able to not let their children feel that they're hungry.
So Hiba, sadly, this is not the first time that we've talked about this topic, but the UN is now warning of imminent famine in Sudan, with 18 million people already hungry. When people hear these numbers, I think the human stories can often get lost and they just sound like statistics. So on a human level, what does that actually look like? How does hunger manifest day to day?
You see parents crying because they're helpless, they can't feed their children. You see fathers, looking frustrated, filled with despair because they're supposed to be providing for their families. They're supposed to be giving them, some kind of livelihood, food and drink and, some kind of shelter. But because of displacement, because of the fact that people have lost so much of what they used to have, whether it's their homes, whether it's their means of income, So these stories are stories that you hear over and over again, oh, I've lost my source of income. I can't feed my children anymore. I have been displaced. I have no home and I have to rely on humanitarian assistance, or I'm trapped in a conflict zone and there is no humanitarian assistance coming in, or there is food. It's just I can't afford it. I spoke to a parent just a couple of months back in Port Sudan, in Eastern Sudan, and she said she had to choose between her children what they should eat and how much one can get. The older one would get half a slice of bread, for example, and then the other would get a full slice. And that's because, according to her, the younger needs more food. He's growing, he spends more energy running around. And I'm not talking per meal here. I'm talking per day. This is what she has to choose for her children, who gets how much to eat, who does not get to eat, who goes home on an empty stomach, or who goes to sleep on an empty stomach. So these are the stories that you hear. This is what hunger on the ground means. And it means more often than not seeing parents cry because as bad as the situation is, there's nothing that they can do to ease the suffering that they're going through.
Yeah. You've spent a lot of time in IDP camps for internally displaced people in Sudan. What is the sense you get when you talk to people, mothers like the one you just mentioned, fathers, children, about how secure or insecure they feel about their next meal? And then what do they do about it? And they're telling you these stories, like what is the solution?
So first of all, I've been covering conflicts in Sudan and in South Sudan and elsewhere for years now. I have not seen such frustration and desperation in displaced people as much as I'm seeing when I speak to the IDPs this time around, whether it's in Port Sudan, whether it's in Gadaref state in the east, whether it's in Khartoum, people feeling that there's nothing they can do, that the world has given up on them, that the humanitarian organizations have given up on them, that there's no one standing by their sides, It's kind of sad, and it is heartbreaking to see that, because one thing that covering conflicts in Sudan I've always been sure of is the resilience of the people. People have always found a way to make it work. Before this war, when people in Darfur who have been displaced in Darfur because of the conflict, women would go out, try to get firewood, they would try to get water, they would try to make little, farming areas inside the displacement camps to be able to feed themselves in addition to the humanitarian assistance that they were getting. So there were ways around it, they tried to be creative, they tried to be resilient. That was back then. This time around, because of the way the conflict has evolved, because of the fact that many people are not actually in camps, they're in schools, they're in shelters, they're living with host communities, they don't have that leeway. They can't start, just farming randomly and trying to find an alternative source of feeding themselves besides the humanitarian assistance or the assistance they're getting from host communities. So there is a lot of frustration this time around. There's a lot of anger that nobody is paying attention to them. And overall, it's just heartbreaking when you see children, try to pat you and ask for little things, biscuits, sweets, because, people are trapped between the warring sides and they can't access humanitarian assistance. They can't access their livelihoods. They can't do anything but wait until either things get better and they get humanitarian assistance or they die.
Wow. After the break, how Sudanese people, both inside the country and in the diaspora, are trying to provide food for those who need it most. So, Hiba, we hear these numbers. 2.5 million people could die from hunger by September 2024. That comes from a Dutch think tank, which cites depleted harvests, soaring prices, imports diminishing. But last May, the Sudanese military and its rival in this war, the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, agreed to allow humanitarian corridors that would let aid workers get people the support they need. So what happened to that agreement, and why are we facing numbers like the ones I just quoted?
Well, like any agreement between the army and the RSF, it never materialized. It's always been ink on paper. The two sides agreed that there will be humanitarian corridors. Humanitarian workers would be able to deliver supplies to those trapped in areas of conflict. And more importantly, those who are in areas of conflict but want to leave would be able to do that. But in reality, that never materialized. Aid workers still have a tough time getting to those in need. People who are trapped in conflict areas, they have to negotiate with whoever is at the checkpoint that they're going through at that time to be able to leave those areas of conflict. Often, they would leave with everything that they are able to carry, whether that be the clothes on their backs or, some cooking pots or a bed or a mattress because they don't know how long the journey would be and they've got elderly and kids with them. But then what would happen is at a checkpoint, those would be stolen from them and would have to just come to a specific point that is safe with just the clothes on their back. Humanitarian assistance, well, it's not delivered to those in need. People are trapped in areas of conflict, whether it's in Darfur, whether it's in the Kurdistan area, whether it's in places like Jazeera state. They can't get the assistance because the army on one side is not allowing aid into RSF territories, but then when it gets to RSF territories, if they do agree on it, there's also the issue of looting and lack of security for the aid workers and for those delivering the supplies. So very little actually does get to those in need, if it gets there at all. But there's also the fact that this whole humanitarian response is severely underfunded. Again, I've covered conflicts. I've never seen the international community turn a blind eye to any catastrophe as much as they've been doing it to the Sudanese catastrophe. We're talking about the world's largest displacement crisis, Malika, not just anything. It's the world's largest internal displacement crisis. About 9 million people have been displaced around the country. We're talking about the fact that 5 million people are on the verge of famine, with 2.5 million people that could die potentially by September because of the lack of harvests and the soaring food prices. These are numbers, but these are also human lives. But when you look at the funding for the aid organizations, especially the UN appeal, it's 15% funded. That's a disgrace. And that shows that, the international community, they're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. They're not ready to put in their money. But ultimately, the responsibility, obviously, is not just the international community. It's the fact that the warring parties have failed to recognize that between them, there are more than 14 million people who are trapped, who are losing their lives, who are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance, who are dying day by day. So there is responsibility, obviously not equal responsibility when it comes to the warring parties and the international community, but all sides here are failing the ordinary Sudanese people who did not ask for this conflict.
Because you're living through this conflict, I'm interested in why you think it is that you have never seen such underfunding when it comes to the dire need and then the lack of countries willing to step up and fill that need. Is it war fatigue? Is it racism? Is it something else?
It's all of the above. There is war fatigue. Sudan has had conflicts since its independence in 1956. But there's also, if you're talking about war fatigue, when you look at their humanitarian response for Ukraine during the first year of its conflict, and you look at the humanitarian response for Sudan during its first year of its conflict, it's not equal. These are both countries that are facing conflict. And when you look at how refugees have been welcomed in Europe from Ukraine, and when you look at how refugees are being welcomed from Sudan, into Europe or into neighboring countries, you can see the difference. So you know that there is racism at play. But I also think, and it's worth mentioning the fact that, humanitarian actors are waiting on the fact that, they want to see political change on the ground. They want to see military change on the ground in this case, because it's a military conflict. And waiting for that comes at the expense of people, human lives, people who are dying, people who are waiting for assistance. That's a failure on the part of the international community. They should understand that these are people, these are human lives, these are mothers who have to watch their children go to bed hungry. These are fathers who watch their children become thinner and thinner every single day. And that's the reality, it's the truth. It's not as much as you're fatigued. If you're tired of hearing the stories about the conflict, if you're tired about, hearing about Sudan again in your briefing or whether it's in the headlines, you have to understand that those on the ground are even more exhausted or even more tired. And while yours could be just fatigue, theirs is an issue of life and death.
While the international community falls short, activists like Mohanad, the Khartoum kitchen founder we heard from earlier, are left to fill the gap.
Khartoum Kitchen started basically with a conversation with my cousin, who's displaced in northern Omdurman. And he was telling me about the hunger situation that he was seeing on a daily basis. And then what we agreed upon is that I would provide funding for a pilot project. and he would run it. But a significant challenge in working is the security risk in places like Khartoum and Khartoum North, which is known locally as Bahri. So, for example, we have a kitchen I can't specify the location, in Khartoum North for security reasons. Well, the only way we are able to supply it is by riverboat. And the reason, these are areas that an international humanitarian organization could never work in. The reason why we have people that are willing to take this sort of risk is because they have families living in those areas which need food. And they are on the borderline of experiencing famine. A large number of people is still trapped in Khartoum city. The majority of Khartoum city has been abandoned. The majority of the population has fled. However, there is a significant population that still remains, usually the most vulnerable, and we are providing them with food boxes. It's just simply too dangerous to set up any kind of kitchen within a Khartoum city. There have been a number of incidents of kitchen managers, community kitchen managers, being either killed, detained, or disappeared in areas of the militia.
Mohanad feels launching Khartoum Kitchen has helped take some of the burden off already suffering people in Sudan who've been doing similar work. And he knows people have come to rely on their kitchens.
The majority of people doing community kitchens in Khartoum are IDPs. So they are already impoverished themselves. We have people who are completely dependent on our kitchen. The only source of food that they are getting on a regular basis is from our kitchen. We hear a lot of terrible stories. There's a man who, a couple of months ago, his wife died of starvation. So there's a lot of horrific situations. There are people who are dying of hunger. There's severe child malnutrition. And our kitchens are, in the areas that they operate, literally a lifesaver. We're not the only community kitchens. There's a lot in Sudan who are trying to do the same thing. And it's a response to the fact that we're not getting enough support internationally coming into Sudan.
So Hiba, in the absence of enough international support, we know that many Sudanese people have been stepping up themselves and coming up with initiatives of their own. Earlier, you mentioned the resiliency and the creativity that you've seen. The Khartoum Kitchen is one that you pointed us in the direction to. But overall, people are having to rely on themselves and their neighbors. How long can that last, though?
Not very long, because people are becoming more and more desperate and more reliant on each other, and it's becoming harder and harder. And where food is available, the prices are becoming more and more expensive. So this is not a sustainable project, trying to rely on neighbors, trying to rely on yourself, waiting for humanitarian assistance. That is not a sustainable way of living. If my neighbor has a source of income and I don't, and prices are continuing to go higher and higher, at some point, instead of being able to help me with a meal a day, he wouldn't be able to, because he'd have to feed himself and his family who are relying on him. It's just a matter of time before your neighbor says, well, you know what? I care about you, but I can't keep feeding you. It's all a matter of time. And the clock is ticking. That's the sad part. The clock is ticking. So if there is a way around that, of course, it would be, first of all, to open humanitarian corridors for people to be able to get assistance, but also to allow them to be able to access their own farms and livelihoods, That's not happening at the moment. So is this going to get better? No. Is it going to get worse? Unfortunately, yes, that's what we're looking at. It's not getting any better, any single bit.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Ashish Malhotra, Chloe Cayley, and Sonia Bhagat, with Duha Mossad, Sarí el-Khalili, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Alex Roldan is our sound designer. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.